In 1979, a man finished his lunch on a restaurant patio in Brooklyn, lit a cigar, and waited for his coffee. His two bodyguards were sitting right beside him. The men who walked in with ski masks and shotguns 30 seconds later left 3 people dead on that patio. The bodyguards walked away without a scratch. They had already made their deal the week before. The Godfather tells you the Mafia had a code, that loyalty was everything, that violence was a last resort carried by men with principles and reasons. The documented record tells a different story, a much darker one. Built from FBI files, Senate testimony, court records, and government investigations that most people have never read because a film came along in 1972 and told the story so beautifully that the truth never stood a chance. What this film hid about real Mafia violence is worse than anything it showed you.
Section 1. The Assassination of Salvatore Maranzano, September 10th, 1931. Here is what The Godfather tells you about how power changes hands in the mob. A don sits at the head of a table. Men in suits speak carefully. Someone makes a decision. Someone else carries it out cleanly. There is gravity to it. There is ritual. The violence, when it comes, has the weight of a verdict that was earned. Here is what actually happened when Lucky Luciano took power in 1931. 4 men walked into an office building in Midtown Manhattan. They were not Italian.
Luciano had specifically chosen them because none of Salvatore Maranzano's people would recognize their faces. The men rode the elevator to the 9th floor of the New York Central Building at 230 Park Avenue, now called the Helmsley Building, a few blocks north of Grand Central Station. They walked into the waiting area of the Eagle Building Corporation, which was the front company Maranzano used to run his operations. They showed fake government credentials to the secretary. They lined the 9 other people in the waiting room against the wall. Then one of them, pointed out by Tommy Lucchese, who was already inside and there to identify the target, forced Maranzano into his private office. What happened in that office was not clean. Maranzano fought back. There were sounds of struggle. When it was over, his body had been stabbed multiple times and shot. Sources put the stab wounds at 6 and the bullet wounds at 4 or 5, depending on which account you read. Maranzano's throat was slashed. The killers ran to the stairwell, bumped into an Irish gunman named Vincent Call, who was on his way up to the same building to carry out a separate hit Maranzano had arranged on Luciano himself, and disappeared into the midday crowds of Midtown Manhattan. The only known photographs of Salvatore Maranzano are from the crime scene. Now understand what Maranzano actually was. He was not a street thug. He had studied for the priesthood in Sicily before entering the criminal world. He was obsessed with Julius Caesar and had modeled his entire vision of organized crime on the Roman military structure. Bosses, underbosses, captains, soldiers. He had spent the previous year and a half fighting the Castellano War, a brutal territorial conflict against rival boss Joe Masseria that had cost dozens of lives across New York. He won that war, largely because Luciano had secretly switched sides near the end, engineering Masseria's death at a Coney Island restaurant in April 1931 in exchange for Maranzano's promise of power and territory. Masseria died at that restaurant with the ace of spades in his hand while playing cards. Luciano had excused himself to use the bathroom before the shooting started. With Masseria gone, Maranzano declared himself capo di tutti capi, boss of all bosses, and summoned crime leaders from across the country to a meeting in Wappingers Falls, New York, where he laid out the new structure that would govern American organized crime. 5 families in New York, a chain of command, rules, his rules. He then immediately started breaking his own deal with Luciano. He cut into Luciano's rackets in the garment district, He demanded tribute from families that had fought alongside him. He brought in Mad Dog Call, a freelance Irish gunman with a reputation for recklessness, specifically to eliminate Luciano and Vito Genovese. Luciano found out through Tommy Lucchese, who was close enough to Maranzano's inner circle to hear the plan, so Luciano moved first. From the moment Maranzano died, September 10, 1931, to the moment Luciano and his allies finished consolidating power, there was a period sometimes called the Night of the Sicilian Vespers. The claim, passed down through mob history, is that Luciano's network eliminated dozens of old guard Maranzano loyalists across the country in the days that followed, clearing out the men most likely to resist the new order. Historians debate the scale. What is not debated is that Maranzano's death was the pivot point, the moment when the generation that had come up in Sicily, with their old world codes and their refusal to work with anyone who wasn't Sicilian, lost control of American organized crime to men like Luciano, who saw it as a business rather than a bloodline. Luciano then abolished the title of Capo di tutti capi entirely. He understood what Maranzano had not, that one man claiming supremacy over all the others just put a permanent target on his head. Instead, Luciano built the Commission, a governing council of family bosses who would settle disputes collectively. No single person at the top. Everyone with a seat, everyone with something to lose. The structure that The Godfather presents as ancient, almost sacred, the Commission, the five families, the chain of command, was invented in 1931 by a man who had just orchestrated a stabbing in a Park Avenue office building and was now trying to make sure it never happened to him. The Godfather begins with a wedding and a man asking for a favor. The real beginning was a crime scene on the 9th floor of a midtown skyscraper. 4 men with borrowed badges and a secretary pressed against a wall, while something irreversible happened behind a closed door. The film gives you the architecture. This is what was poured in the foundation. The structure Luciano built that September would go largely undisturbed for the next 2 decades. 5 families, a commission, rules that everyone agreed to follow because breaking them had consequences. What those consequences looked like in practice, and how systematically they were applied across hundreds of targets in cities from New York to Detroit to Los Angeles, stayed almost entirely hidden from the public until a single man sat down in a government building and started talking. That story involves a candy store in Brooklyn, an ice pick in a doctor's bag, and a murder operation so large and so methodical it ran like a shift at a factory. Section 2. Murder, Inc. The Brownsville Killing Machine, 1930s to 1941. There was a candy store on the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenues in Brownsville, Brooklyn. It was called Midnight Roses, named after the woman who ran it. It stayed open around the clock. People came in, bought things, used the payphone in the back, and left. Neighbors knew the regulars. Nobody thought too much about it. That candy store was the operational headquarters of the most prolific contract elimination operation in American history. The organization ran through the 1930s and into the early 1940s. The press eventually called it Murder, Inc. The men who ran it called it nothing. It was simply work. When a contract came in through the syndicate's national network, someone made a call to the payphone at Midnight Roses. The killers on rotation that day were dispatched with a bag. Inside the bag, a firearm, an ice pick, and a garrote. They would board a train, travel to whichever city the target was located in, carry out the job, and return. The whole system was designed around one core principle. The people doing the work never knew the target personally, and the target never knew them. Strangers executing strangers on behalf of bosses who never touched anything. Estimates on the total number of people eliminated by the operation range from 400 to over 1,000. The uncertainty is not an exaggeration. It reflects how many of the cases were never solved, never connected, never even recognized as connected to the same organization. The man most directly responsible for running the operation on the ground was Abe Relis, known as Kid Twist, a name he took from an earlier Brooklyn criminal he admired. By the time Relis was 34 years old, he had been arrested 42 times, 6 of those times for taking a life. He had served 6 separate prison sentences. He was not a large man.
And he was not particularly intimidating to look at. What he had was a complete absence of hesitation and a memory that law enforcement would later describe as almost frightening in its precision. The preferred tools of the operation were quiet ones. The ice pick was favored because it left a small wound that could be missed in a cursory examination, and because it made almost no sound. The garrote was used when a body needed to disappear cleanly. Firearms were available but attracted attention. The point was not spectacle. The point was efficiency. Alongside Relis, the operation included men like Harry Strauss, known as Pittsburgh Phil, described by prosecutors as the most prolific individual contract eliminator the investigation had uncovered. There was also Harry Maione, Frank Abendando, Louis Capone, and Mendy Weiss. These were not men on the fringes of the organization. They were its core workforce, dispatched regularly across the East Coast and as far as the Midwest, removing people that the syndicate's leadership had decided needed to be removed. The leadership that gave those orders included Louis Buchalter, known as Lepke, who ran the garment district rackets in New York and used the operation to eliminate anyone who threatened his business or might talk to investigators. Albert Anastasia, who would later become a boss in his own right, served as a senior figure overseeing the Brooklyn operation. The clients were the bosses of the National Crime Syndicate, men who needed problems solved quietly and at a distance, with no connection back to themselves. The operation fell apart because of one decision made by one man under pressure. In 1940, Relis was arrested on a charge unrelated to the elimination operation, facing serious time and believing, correctly, that certain people in the syndicate were considering removing him permanently to prevent exactly what he was about to do. He made contact with Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer and started talking. What came out of Relis's mouth over the following months stunned investigators. He had total recall. He provided names, dates, locations, methods, and participants for approximately 70 unsolved cases. Cases the police hadn't even known were connected to each other. He described the internal mechanics of the operation with the same ease a factory worker might describe a shift. He knew which contracts had been approved by which bosses. He knew how the money moved. He knew who had done what to whom, and in which city, and with which tool. Other members of the operation, seeing what was happening, began to cooperate as well. Ali Tannenbaum, Seymour Magoon, Abe Levine, and Sholem Bernstein all eventually provided testimony. The resulting prosecutions sent multiple men to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. Buchalter was executed in 1944, the only top organized crime figure in American history to receive the death penalty. Pittsburgh Phil Strauss went to the chair. Maione went. Abandando went. Relis himself never made it to the end of the trials. On November 12, 1941, while being held in a guarded room on the 6th floor of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, under 24-hour police protection, Relis went out a window and fell 7 stories. He was found dead on a lower rooftop. The official explanation was that he had been attempting to escape using a makeshift rope of bed sheets, and it had failed. Almost nobody believed this. The room had multiple police officers assigned to it. Relis had been the prosecution's most valuable witness and was scheduled to testify in upcoming trials. His death ended several of those cases permanently. No one was ever charged. The Godfather shows you an organization where violence is a last resort, sanctioned at the top, and carried out reluctantly by men who understand the weight of what they are doing. Murder, Inc.,
was a scheduling operation. The weight did not factor in. The ice pick went in the bag, the man boarded the train, and someone in Brooklyn answered the payphone.
Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Relis's testimony had cracked the operation open, but it had not reached the people at the very top of the structure, the bosses who approved the contracts and then went home to their families. That level of the organization would stay hidden for another 2 decades, until a low-ranking soldier in a federal prison made a decision that would put the entire thing on national television, in front of millions of people who had no idea any of it existed.
Section 3. Joseph Valachi's Senate Testimony, October 1963. On September 27, 1963, a short, heavy-set man in his late 50s walked into a Senate hearing room in Washington, D.C., surrounded by approximately 200 United States Marshals. The security presence alone told you something. This was not a routine appearance. The man sat down at the witness table, looked out at the cameras, and began describing a world that the American government had spent decades trying to prove existed. His name was Joseph Michael Valachi. He was a soldier, the lowest rank of made member, in the Genovese crime family of New York. He had been involved in organized crime since the 1920s. He had been present for some of the most significant internal events in the history of American organized crime, including the Castellano War that ended with Maranzano's fall in 1931. He had taken lives. He had moved narcotics. He had collected money for bosses whose names most Americans had never heard.
And now he was going to explain all of it, on television, to the United States Senate. The reason Valachi was there was not idealism. In 1962, while serving a 15-year sentence for narcotics trafficking at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Valachi became convinced that Vito Genovese, his own boss, who was incarcerated in the same facility, had ordered a contract on his life. Whether Genovese actually had done this is unclear. What is clear is that Valachi believed it completely. In the prison yard, he encountered a man he was certain had been sent to eliminate him. He picked up a metal pipe and beat the man to death. The man was not who Valachi thought he was. He was another inmate with no connection to any contract. Valachi had taken the life of the wrong person entirely. Now facing a potential death sentence on top of his existing prison time, with no protection from the organization he believed had already marked him for removal, Valachi made contact with federal investigators. He agreed to tell them everything. What followed was unlike anything law enforcement had received before. Valachi had been active in organized crime for over 3 decades. He had a memory that investigators described as extraordinarily detailed. Dates, names, locations, methods, internal terminology, chain of command. He described the initiation ceremony he had undergone in 1930, which involved a gun, a knife, and a burning piece of paper passed between hands while an oath was spoken. He explained that members referred to the organization among themselves not as the Mafia, but as Cosa Nostra, meaning this thing of ours in Italian. He laid out the structure. Soldiers organized into crews under a capo, crews answering to a boss, bosses forming a governing body called the Commission. He named the 5 families operating in New York at the time of his testimony. He identified their bosses. He described how disputes were settled, how contracts were approved, how money moved up through the structure, and how men who stepped out of line were handled. The hearings ran across multiple sessions into early October 1963. Portions were broadcast on national television. Millions of Americans watched. For the overwhelming majority of them, this was the first time they had heard any of this confirmed as fact rather than rumor. The FBI had long maintained files on organized crime figures, but the public understanding of the actual structure, the Commission, the 5 families, the formal hierarchy,
had never been laid out this clearly, this publicly, by someone who had lived inside it. Senator John McClellan, the Arkansas Democrat who chaired the subcommittee, used the hearings to push for expanded federal authority to investigate and prosecute organized crime.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy testified that Valachi's information represented a critical intelligence breakthrough. The testimony directly contributed to the legislative momentum that eventually produced the RICO Act in 1970, the federal racketeering statute that would later be used to prosecute entire crime families rather than just individual members. There is a specific detail about Valachi's testimony that tends to get lost. He was not a boss. He was not a capo. He was a soldier, a street-level earner who ran small operations and did what he was told. His knowledge of the organization's upper levels came from proximity and observation over decades, not from a seat at the table. When he named bosses and described the commission, he was describing things he had witnessed and heard, not things he had personally controlled. This matters because it reveals something about the structure that The Godfather consistently obscures. In the film, the Corleone family is a tight, knowable unit. Don Corleone is at the center of everything. Information flows clearly. Decisions are made by people who understand the full picture. What Valachi described was something far more compartmentalized. Soldiers knew their crew, they knew their capo, they knew what they were told, and nothing more. The bosses operated at a distance specifically so that no single person's testimony could bring the whole structure down. The organization was designed to be unknowable from the inside at any single level. Valachi's testimony was so significant precisely because he had been around long enough and close enough to enough different situations to piece together more than a soldier was supposed to know. The Godfather was released 9 years after Valachi testified. The film's portrayal of the commission, the 5 families, the internal codes, none of it was invented by Mario Puzo or Francis Ford Coppola. The bones of it were already in the congressional record, available to anyone who had paid attention in 1963. What the film did was take that documented structure and give it warmth, dignity, and a family at the center that you were made to care about. Valachi himself died in federal custody in April 1971, less than a year before the film came out. He never saw what his testimony helped create. Valachi had described the structure from the bottom looking up, a soldier's view, limited by design. What the public still had no real picture of was what the structure looked like at the very top, in the room where the bosses themselves sat. That picture arrived 6 years after Valachi testified, not through a courtroom or a congressional hearing, but through a shooting in a hotel barbershop on a Tuesday morning in Midtown Manhattan, carried out in front of 14 witnesses, none of whom ever told investigators a single useful thing. Section 4. The Death of Albert Anastasia in a Barbershop, October 25, 1957. At 10:20 in the morning on October 25, 1957, Albert Anastasia walked into the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel on the corner of 56th Street and 7th Avenue in Midtown Manhattan. He sat down in chair number 4. The barber placed a hot towel over his face. Anastasia leaned back and closed his eyes. His driver had parked the car in the underground garage and then left to take a walk outside. His bodyguard, Anthony Coppola, was not present. Whether Coppola stepped away on his own or was told to be somewhere else that morning has never been established. What is established is that in the moment Anastasia was most exposed, face covered, eyes closed, alone in a public room, 2 men walked in. They had scarves pulled up over their faces. They moved directly to chair 4. They shoved the barber out of the way with the muzzle of a firearm and opened fire. Anastasia took multiple rounds. What happened next became one of the most discussed moments in the entire history of American organized crime.
Despite being struck several times,
Anastasia got up from the chair. He lunged toward the men who had just fired at him, but he was disoriented, bleeding, and possibly not fully conscious of where he was in the room. He attacked the wrong target entirely. He went for the reflections of his attackers in the barbershop mirror, rather than the men themselves. He crashed into the glass and collapsed to the floor. By the time police arrived, Albert Anastasia, the man who had run Murder Inc., who had overseen hundreds of eliminations, who had been arrested 6 separate times for taking a life and had walked free every time, was dead in a pile of bloody towels on a barbershop floor. 14 people witnessed it. 100 detectives were assigned to the investigation. The case was never solved. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what Anastasia was and who wanted him gone. He had been born Umberto Anastasio in Tropea, Calabria, in southern Italy in 1902. He came to the United States as a young man, settled in Brooklyn, and entered the criminal world through the waterfront, specifically through control of the longshoremen's unions at the Brooklyn docks, which gave the organization enormous leverage over what moved in and out of the port of New York. He rose through the ranks of what would eventually become the Gambino family, serving under boss Vincent Mangano. In April 1951, Mangano disappeared and was never seen again. His brother Philip was found shot twice in the face and once in the neck in a marshy area near Jamaica Bay. Anastasia told the commission that the Manganos had been planning to have him removed first, and that he had simply acted in self-defense. The commission accepted this explanation. It is worth pausing on that fact, because the commission's acceptance of a man's account of why he had removed his own boss tells you something significant about how power actually functioned. And Anastasia was confirmed as the new head of the family. As boss through the 1950s, he accumulated enemies with remarkable speed. He was temperamental, expansive in his ambitions, and increasingly reckless in his decision-making. He was attempting to move into the casino business in Cuba, where Santo Trafficante Jr. had already established significant operations, and where Trafficante had no interest in sharing. More critically, he had developed a serious conflict with Vito Genovese, who was working to consolidate power across the New York families, and saw Anastasia as both a rival and an obstacle. Carlo Gambino, who was serving as Anastasia's underboss, had his own reasons to want a change at the top. The arrangement Genovese offered Gambino was direct. Help us remove Anastasia, and you take the family. Gambino agreed. Meyer Lansky, whose financial interests were tangled through the casino operations, gave his approval. The men believed to have carried out the actual shooting have been identified by multiple sources over the years as associates of the Gallo brothers, a crew within the Colombo family. Joe Gallo himself reportedly told associates afterward, referencing himself and 4 others, "You can just call the 5 of us the Barbershop Quintet." This line was reported in New York Magazine in 1972. Gallo was never charged. The barber chairs at the Park Sheraton were repositioned after the incident so that they faced away from the mirror. The specific chair Anastasia had been sitting in was later sold at auction for $7,000 and eventually became an exhibit at the Mob Museum in Las Vegas. The barber shop itself no longer exists. The space is now a Starbucks. What this moment exposes about The Godfather is specific. The film presents the taking out of a rival boss as something that requires extensive deliberation, commission approval, careful planning, and a heavy moral reckoning afterward. The Corleones agonize, they weigh consequences, they hold meetings. Anastasia was removed because Genovese wanted more power, and Gambino wanted his boss's job. The planning was political, not moral. His bodyguard was conveniently absent. Nobody in that barbershop talked.
The killing was carried out in a hotel in the middle of Manhattan on a Tuesday morning, in front of more than a dozen people, and the entire apparatus of New York law enforcement produced nothing. Not a charge, not an arrest, not a single prosecution in nearly 7 decades since. The Godfather gives mob violence the texture of tragic necessity. The chair in the Mob Museum in Las Vegas, with its documented provenance and its price tag of $7,000, suggests something closer to the truth, that it was routine enough to be processed and moved on from, the way any other piece of business gets processed and moved on from. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Anastasia's removal made Carlo Gambino the most powerful figure in New York organized crime. That consolidation of power under Gambino would shape everything that followed, including the next 2 decades of the family's operations and the specific chain of events that eventually produced the most publicly brazen organized crime elimination in the history of the United States, carried out not in a closed room or a hotel barbershop, but on a crowded Manhattan street during the Christmas shopping rush, in front of everyone. Section 5. The Assassination of Carmine __0_Galante, July 12, 1979. It was 87 degrees in Brooklyn on July 12, 1979. Carmine Galante arrived at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant at 205 Knickerbocker Avenue in the Bushwick neighborhood sometime around midday. The restaurant was owned by his cousin, Giuseppe Turano. Galante had been coming here for years. He knew everyone in the building. He sat down at a table on the open patio in the back garden, facing the rear of the building so he could watch the entrance. His 2 Sicilian bodyguards, Baldassare Amato and Cesare Bonventre, sat with him. A Bonanno family capo named Leonard Coppola joined the table. Turano came out and ate with them. They finished their meal. Galante lit a cigar. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, 3 men in ski masks entered the restaurant through the front, walked through the building, and came out onto the patio. The table was immediately sprayed with gunfire from shotguns and handguns. Galante was struck by a shotgun blast to the upper chest and by rounds that tore through his left eye and riddled his torso. He was thrown backward from his chair into a small tomato patch growing along the garden wall. Turano and Coppola were both shot in the head and died at the scene. Amato and Bonventre, the 2 bodyguards whose entire purpose was to protect Galante, were untouched. They did not attempt to intervene. After the shooting, they simply left. When the coroner's attendants carried Galante's body out on a stretcher through the front of the restaurant, it passed beneath a sign on the wall that read, "We give special attention to outgoing orders." His cigar was still in his teeth. The photographs taken at the scene ran on the front pages of newspapers across the country. The image became one of the most reproduced in the history of American organized crime coverage. A dead man in a garden, glasses still on his face, cigar still clenched, surrounded by the wreckage of a lunch table. Carmine Galante had said, not long before this afternoon, that no one would ever take him out because no one would dare. To understand the full weight of what happened in that garden, you need to know what Galante actually was. He had been involved in criminal activity since childhood. By his teenage years, he was already running with serious figures in the New York underworld. His arrest record dated back to 1926 and included charges for assault, robbery, and taking a life, though he was never successfully prosecuted for the latter. Law enforcement suspected him of involvement in somewhere between 80 and 100 acts of lethal violence over his career. In 1943, he was accused of shooting and fatally wounding anti-fascist newspaper publisher Carlo Tresca on a Manhattan street on behalf of Vito Genovese, who was allegedly doing a favor for Benito Mussolini's government. No charges were ever brought. Through the 1950s,
Galante was instrumental in setting up the heroin pipeline that ran from Sicily through Montreal and into the United States, an operation that flooded American cities with narcotics for decades. In 1962, he was convicted on narcotics charges and sentenced to 20 years. He was released on parole in 1974. The day he walked out of the federal penitentiary in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, he ordered the tombstone of former New York boss Frank Costello destroyed with explosives. It was a statement. He was back, and he intended to be taken seriously. By the late 1970s, Galante had effectively seized control of the Bonanno family, ignoring the commission-appointed boss, Philip Rastelli, who was himself incarcerated, and had begun positioning himself to dominate the narcotics trade across all 5 New York families. He had surrounded himself with Sicilian-born criminals known within the organization as Zips, recently arrived men with direct connections to suppliers in Sicily. He was cutting other families out of the narcotics revenue they had come to depend on. He had declared himself, in effect, the boss of all bosses, a title that Luciano had deliberately abolished in 1931 precisely because it made the holder an immediate target. The commission's response was methodical. Genovese family boss Frank Thierry began building consensus among the other family heads. Rastelli, despite being in prison, formally requested commission approval to have Galante removed. The request was granted. The planning was handed to 2 senior Bonanno capos, Alphonse Indelicato, known as Sonny Red, and Dominic Napolitano, known as Sonny Black. The most important part of the plan was not finding shooters. It was flipping Galante's own bodyguards. Amato and Bonventry were approached and offered promotions and a larger share of the family's narcotics operation if they cooperated. They agreed without hesitation. They drove Galante to the restaurant. They sat with him through lunch. They moved out of the line of fire when the moment came. The man who had trusted them completely, who had imported them from Sicily specifically because he believed old country loyalty was more reliable than American-born affiliations, was handed to the shooters by the 2 people sitting closest to him. One person was eventually convicted in connection with the Galante elimination. Anthony Indelicato, Bruno, the son of Sonny Red, was photographed by FBI surveillance being congratulated outside a Manhattan social club in the hours following the shooting. He was convicted at the commission trial in 1986 and served 19 years. The other participants were never prosecuted. The Godfather's violence has purpose and proportion. You cross the family, you face consequences. The logic is presented as almost juridical, an internal justice system with its own rules and its own enforcement. What happened to Galante was closer to a corporate takeover. The board of directors voted. The bodyguards were bought. The target was delivered to the table. The cigar was still burning when it was over. This was how the commission actually functioned when it worked, not as a court of last resort, but as a mechanism for powerful men to eliminate whoever had become inconvenient, using the people that inconvenient person trusted the most. What the Galante elimination showed was the commission at its most organized, a collective decision, methodically executed, with the bodyguards doing half the work. But the commission's authority was never absolute, and its rules were never permanent. Within 6 years of Galante's removal, a man inside one of the 5 families would decide the commission's approval was optional, bypass it entirely, and carry out the most publicly visible organized crime elimination in American history on a street in Midtown Manhattan while Christmas shoppers walked past. Section 6. The Murder of Paul Castellano, December 16, 1985. It was the Monday before Christmas. Midtown Manhattan was packed. Office workers were finishing their days. Shoppers were moving along the sidewalks.
and the stretch of East 46th Street near 3rd Avenue was lit up and busy the way it always is in New York in mid-December. At approximately 5:16 in the evening, a black Lincoln sedan pulled up in front of Sparks Steakhouse. Paul Castellano stepped out of the passenger side. 4 men in white trench coats and Russian-style fur hats were already positioned near the entrance. They opened fire immediately. Castellano was struck 6 times and collapsed on the sidewalk.
His driver and newly appointed underboss, Thomas Valachi, was getting out of the car on the other side when a 5th shooter approached from behind and put a round in the back of his head. Valachi was struck 4 times total. Both men were left on the pavement. The shooters walked away into the crowd and were gone. Across the street, in a parked car, John Gotti watched through the window to confirm the job was done. Sitting next to him was Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull. Gotti had a walkie-talkie. He had given the order when Castellano's car pulled up to the red light on the corner. This is not speculation. Gravano testified to all of it under oath at Gotti's 1992 trial. Paul Castellano had been the boss of the Gambino family, the largest and most profitable of the 5 New York families, since 1976, when he inherited the position after the natural death of Carlo Gambino, his first cousin and brother-in-law.
Gambino had chosen Castellano over other candidates, specifically because of his business acumen. Where most bosses built their reputations through direct involvement in street-level operations, Castellano preferred construction, meat distribution, and trucking. Industries where organized crime's influence could generate enormous revenue without the visibility that came with narcotics and street enforcement. At the time of his removal, the Gambino family's annual revenue was estimated at $500 million. Castellano lived in a 17-room mansion on Tote Hill in Staten Island, the highest point of elevation on the eastern seaboard south of Maine. He rarely left it. He held meetings there rather than at social clubs. He maintained a housekeeper, Gloria Olarte, with whom he was having a relationship, a fact that became significant when FBI agents in 1983 successfully planted a listening device in his kitchen. The subsequent recordings produced more than 600 hours of conversations. Those recordings led to 8 separate criminal trials and resulted in Castellano being under active federal indictment at the time of his removal. The internal situation inside the Gambino family had been deteriorating for years before December 1985. Castellano had a strict policy against narcotics trafficking, a rule he imposed partly for legal reasons and partly because he considered it beneath the family's more sophisticated business operations. Several of his captains, including Gotti's close associate Angelo Ruggiero, had been caught on separate FBI wiretaps discussing heroin deals. Castellano demanded to hear those tapes. The captains involved resisted. The standoff created a direct threat. If Castellano got the tapes and confirmed what was on them, Gotti and his associates faced the possibility of being sanctioned by their own boss. Then, on December 2, 1985, the Gambino family's underboss, Agnello Della Croce, died of cancer. Della Croce had been a buffer between Castellano and the street crews, respected by both sides, capable of managing the tension. His death removed the last person keeping the factions from open conflict. Castellano did not attend the wake. For men whose entire culture was built around loyalty and the physical expression of respect, this was not a minor slight. It was read as a declaration that Castellano did not consider himself bound by the obligations that governed everyone beneath him. Gotti, Gravano, and a small number of other captains began moving toward a decision. The plan that took shape was straightforward in its outline and detailed in its execution. A team of shooters was assembled. The location, Sparks Steakhouse,
was chosen because Castellano had a confirmed reservation there for a dinner meeting on December 16th. Multiple shooters were stationed at different points around the entrance. Backup teams were positioned in case anything went wrong. Gotti and Gravano stationed themselves across the street in the car. The hit was not sanctioned by the commission. Gotti did not seek approval from the other family bosses before acting. This violated one of the most fundamental rules of the structure Luciano had built in 1931. The rule that the removal of a sitting boss required collective agreement from the governing body, specifically to prevent exactly this kind of unilateral power grab. Gotti bypassed it entirely. In January 1986, Gotti held a meeting of Gambino family captains and accepted what was described as a vote, confirming him as the new boss. Approximately 20 captains were present. The vote was not free in any meaningful sense. Gotti had just demonstrated what happened to people he decided were problems, and the captains understood their situation clearly. The Godfather presents the commission as the ultimate authority, a body whose approval constrains even the most powerful men in the organization. The Castellano case is the factual answer to that presentation. When Gotti decided Castellano needed to go, the commission's rules were simply not a factor. The only thing that mattered was whether Gotti had enough people around him who would move when he moved and stay quiet afterward. He did. Castellano's body was removed from the sidewalk in front of Sparks Steakhouse, while the Christmas lights on 46th Street were still blinking. The restaurant stayed open that night. Reservations continued to be honored. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. What made Gotti's rise possible was not just his willingness to bypass the rules. It was the specific texture of violence he was willing to deploy and the men he had around him who shared that willingness. One of those men, already operating out of a bar in Brooklyn for the better part of a decade before Castellano was removed, had built something that made Gotti's crew look restrained by comparison. An operation so methodical and so relentless that when the FBI finally pieced together its full scope, even experienced investigators struggled to process the numbers.
Section 7. The Roy DeMeo Crew and the Gemini Method, 1973 to 1983. Roy DeMeo grew up in the Flatlands neighborhood of Brooklyn. He graduated from James Madison High School in 1959. After school, he got a job in the meat department of a local supermarket, where he learned how to break down animal carcasses, which cuts to make, how to drain, how to separate, how to package. He was good at it. He was also, by the time he graduated, already running a small loan sharking operation out of the same neighborhood. Those two facts about Roy DeMeo turn out to be connected in the worst possible way. By the early 1970s, DeMeo had been brought into the Gambino family through a senior associate named Anthony Gaggi, who recognized in the younger man a combination of financial intelligence and complete indifference to what he was being asked to do. DeMeo assembled his own crew, which operated out of the Gemini Lounge, a bar on Flatlands Avenue in Canarsie, Brooklyn. The crew ran loan sharking, narcotics, and one of the most sophisticated vehicle theft operations in New York City history, stealing thousands of cars and shipping them to buyers in the Middle East and Europe through a network of corrupt dealers and shipping contacts. The elimination operation ran alongside all of it. The method the crew developed, which became known as the Gemini method, named after the bar, was a systematic process for handling targets from the moment they walked in to the moment there was nothing left to find. A target would be brought to a back room of the Gemini Lounge, usually under the pretext of a meeting or a transaction. DeMeo himself would typically be the first to act, using a silenced firearm and immediately wrapping a towel around the wound to control the blood. A second crew member would then stab the target in the chest to stop the heart from continuing to pump. The body would be moved to a bathtub to drain. After that, DeMeo applied the skills he had learned in the supermarket meat department. The remains were wrapped in plastic, placed in bags, put in boxes, and distributed across multiple locations. Dumpsters in different boroughs, bodies of water, landfills. By the time any single piece was found, if it was found at all, there was nothing to connect it to anything else. The FBI's own investigators later described the DeMeo crew as the most prolific criminal elimination operation in the history of American organized crime. Law enforcement has directly confirmed at least 25 acts attributable to DeMeo himself. The crew's total, counting all members across the decade of their operation, is estimated at between 75 and 200. The range is that wide because the method worked. Many of the people they made disappear were never reported missing by anyone who mattered to law enforcement, or were reported and never connected to the crew, or simply ceased to exist without leaving enough physical evidence for anyone to build a case. One of the early cases that illustrates how the operation functioned involved a man named Andre Katz, who had been DeMeo's partner in the vehicle theft ring and who agreed to speak with law enforcement when questioned. When DeMeo found out, Katz was invited to a location under the pretense of a social meeting. He was brought to a butcher shop. He was stabbed in the heart and in the back and decapitated. This was the first documented case associated with the crew, and it established the template. Betrayal meant removal, and removal meant disappearance. By 1982, the FBI had connected enough missing persons and unresolved cases to the Gemini lounge that a serious investigation was underway. A crew member named Vito Arena had been arrested on separate charges and agreed to cooperate with investigators. Arena led police to the body of one victim, a low-level associate, encased in a concrete-filled oil barrel at the bottom of Moriches Bay off Long Island. The FBI began building its case. Separately, FBI surveillance had picked up a conversation between Angelo Ruggiero and Gene Gotti discussing the fact that Gambino boss Paul Castellano had decided DeMeo had become too dangerous a liability. The volume of disappearances connected to the crew was drawing investigative attention that threatened to expose the family's broader operations. Castellano wanted DeMeo removed. The problem was finding someone willing to do it. DeMeo's reputation within the organization was so extreme that John Gotti declined the contract. Gene Gotti declined. Senior capo Frank DeCicco passed as well. The only viable solution was to use someone inside DeMeo's own crew, someone he would not be suspicious of, someone he would let close. On or around January 10, 1983, DeMeo went to a meeting with members of his own crew in Brooklyn. He was shot multiple times in the head. His body was placed in the trunk of his Cadillac. The car was left in the parking lot of a boat club in the Flatlands area of Brooklyn. January temperatures kept the trunk cold. The car sat there for approximately 10 days before complaints from other lot users prompted police to have it towed. When officers opened the trunk, DeMeo's body was frozen. He had been shot 7 times. The suspected shooters were crew members Joseph Testa and Anthony Center. No one was ever convicted of the actual act. The Godfather presents organized crime violence as something that carries moral weight. Decisions made reluctantly by men who understand what they are authorizing. The DeMeo operation was the precise opposite of that. It was industrial, mechanical, and routine. DeMeo ran it the way he had run the meat counter at the supermarket, with specific tools, a specific process, and no particular reflection on what the material in front of him had been before it arrived. What makes this case sit differently from every other case in this video is scale. The Castellano War, Murder Inc., the Anastasia removal, all of those involved significant acts of lethal violence. None of them involved one crew
operating out of one bar over 1 decade, with a confirmed minimum of 75 and the probable total approaching 200. The DeMeo crew did not conduct a war. They ran a production line. Everything covered so far, Maranzano, Murder Inc., Anastasia, Galante, Castellano, DeMeo, took place within American borders, inside the specific world of the American families. But the organization that the Godfather drew its mythology from was not only American. The Sicilian branch of Cosa Nostra was operating simultaneously on its own scale with its own methods, and in 1979, it made a decision about a man named Carmine Galante that connected directly to everything happening in New York. A decade later, it made a decision about a judge that detonated half a ton of explosives under a motorway and registered on volcano monitoring equipment on the other side of the island. Section 8. The Kapaci bombing. The removal of Judge Giovanni Falcone, May 23, 1992. Giovanni Falcone was born in Palermo, Sicily in 1939. In the same neighborhood where many of the men he would later spend his career pursuing had also grown up. He studied law at the University of Palermo and became a magistrate in 1964. By the late 1970s, he was working organized crime cases in Palermo at a time when doing so was, in the most literal sense, a decision about how long you wanted to live. The list of people who had taken that job before him and paid for it with their lives was not short. Judge Cesare Terranova, who had led major prosecutions against Cosa Nostra in the 1960s, was shot and fatally wounded in September 1979. Police investigator Boris Giuliano, who had been tracking the heroin network connecting Sicily to New York, was shot 2 months before that in July 1979. Carabinieri Captain Emanuele Basile was fatally shot in May 1980. Prosecutor Gaetano Costa was shot in August 1980. Falcone's own mentor and supervisor, Rocco Cinici, was eliminated by a car bomb in July 1983. Falcone kept working. What made Falcone genuinely dangerous to Cosa Nostra, more dangerous than any previous investigator they had faced, was a specific methodological innovation. He understood that the organization's power was financial before it was physical, and he began following the money through bank records, wire transfers, and international transactions in a way that Italian law enforcement had not systematically done before. He developed relationships with the first generation of Mafia informants, called pentiti, who provided insider testimony that could be combined with the financial evidence to build cases that were hard to dismantle in court. The product of this approach was the Maxi trial, which ran in a specially constructed bunker courthouse in Palermo from February 1986 to January 1987. The trial resulted in 342 convictions of Cosa Nostra members. 19 defendants received life sentences. It was the largest successful prosecution of organized crime in Italian history, and it was almost entirely the product of Falcone's investigative framework.
Cosa Nostra boss Salvatore Riina, known as Toto, who had been a fugitive since 1969 and was running the organization from hiding, watched the convictions accumulate and made a decision. The organization would no longer attempt to manage its relationship with the Italian state through corruption and political leverage alone. It would demonstrate, in the most visible way possible, that the state could not protect the people who worked against Cosa Nostra. It would remove them. Falcone was not the first target. Riina had already sanctioned the shooting of regional politician Salvatore Lima in March 1992. But Falcone was the primary one, the man whose work had produced the Maxi trial, whose investigative methods were being adopted across Italy, and who, at the time of his removal, had moved to Rome to work at the Ministry of Justice, where he was developing new anti-organized crime legislation that would make prosecution even harder to evade. The planning was meticulous and took months. The operation was led by Giovanni Brusca.
a senior Cosa Nostra figure known within the organization by a nickname that translates roughly to the Pig, who was personally trusted by Rina to carry out significant operations. Brusca's team conducted surveillance on Falcone's travel patterns. Falcone commuted weekly between Rome, where he worked, and Palermo, where his home was. The route from Palermo's Punta Raisi airport to the city ran along Highway A29, a stretch of motorway that passed through relatively open terrain near the town of Kapaci. The team packed 13 steel drums with a mixture of TNT and ammonium nitrate, totaling approximately 500 kilograms of explosives. The drums were placed in a drainage culvert running beneath the highway. The team ran test detonations on a concrete structure of similar dimensions to confirm the blast would be sufficient. They ran practice drives along the route using flashbulbs to simulate triggering the device on a moving vehicle. The planning was engineering, not improvisation. On May 23, 1992, Falcone flew from Rome to Palermo. He was traveling with his wife, Francesca Morvillo, who was also a magistrate, and a 3-car police escort. Falcone was in the second car. Brusca was positioned on a hill above the highway with a remote detonation device, in contact by telephone with a lookout near the airport who was tracking the convoy's departure. At 5:56 in the afternoon, as the lead car in Falcone's convoy passed over the culvert at Kapaci, Brusca pressed the button. The explosion was large enough to be registered by seismic monitoring equipment at Mount Etna on the opposite side of the island. The lead car was thrown from the road surface into an olive orchard. The 3 officers inside, Vito Schifani, Rocco Di Cillo, and Antonio Montinaro, were killed immediately. Falcone's car crashed into the resulting debris and concrete. Falcone and his wife, who were not wearing seatbelts, were thrown through the windscreen. 4 additional officers in the escort survived with injuries. Falcone died that evening. Francesca Morvillo died shortly after. 5 people were gone. Rina, by multiple accounts, received the news with satisfaction. He had been a fugitive from Italian law for 23 years. He would be arrested in Palermo in January 1993, less than 8 months after the Kapaci bombing. He died in prison in 2017, serving 26 life sentences. Brusca was arrested in May 1996. He subsequently became a government informant and confirmed the operational details of the bombing from inside the planning process. He was released from prison in 2021 after serving 25 years, having admitted to involvement in over 100 acts of lethal violence. The Godfather's Corleone family has a rule that is treated as absolute. No involvement in narcotics because of the political exposure it would bring, and no targeting of government officials, police, or judges, because crossing that line invites a response the organization cannot survive. These rules are presented as the source of the family's longevity and stability. Cosa Nostra detonated 1/2 ton of explosives on a public highway in broad daylight to remove a judge. The explosion moved seismographs. The state's response when it came was the most aggressive crackdown in Italian organized crime history. Rina had invited exactly the response the Corleone rules were designed to avoid, and he had done it deliberately, as a demonstration that the organization feared nothing. The Godfather gives you an organization that understands limits. Kapaci is what an organization looks like when it has decided limits are for other people. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything in this video so far has involved adults, bosses, soldiers, judges, investigators, people who had chosen to be where they were when the violence found them. The next case involves none of that.
It involves a 12-year-old boy who was taken from a riding stable in Sicily in November 1993, held for 779 days in conditions that investigators would later describe as among the most inhumane they had ever documented, and whose fate was decided by 5 words spoken by the man who had pressed the button at Kapaci. Section 9. Giuseppe Di Matteo, taken at 12, gone after 779 days. January 11th, 1996. Giuseppe Di Matteo loved horses. He was 12 years old and spent time at a riding stable in Villabate, a small town outside Palermo in Sicily. On November 23, 1993, 4 men arrived at the stable. They were dressed as police officers. They told the boy they were there to take him to see his father, Santino Di Matteo, who was being held in protective custody on the Italian mainland. Giuseppe went with them without resistance. He had no reason not to. They looked like police. They said they were taking him to his father. They were members of Cosa Nostra. The entire approach had been designed to make a child cooperate. Santino Di Matteo had been a member of the Sicilian Mafia and had taken part in the Kapaci bombing that killed Judge Giovanni Falcone in May 1992. After his arrest in June 1993, he became the first of Falcone's direct attackers to agree to cooperate with the Italian government as a pentito, an informant. He provided investigators with the names of the people who had planned and carried out the bombing, including specific operational details about who had tunneled beneath the motorway, who had packed the explosives, and who had pressed the detonation button. He had already signed a legally binding deposition. The response from Giovanni Brusca, the man who had actually pressed that button at Kapaci, and from Cosa Nostra leadership, including Leoluca Bagarella and Matteo Messina Denaro, was the abduction of Santino's son. The logic was direct. If they could pressure Santino into retracting his testimony, the prosecutions built on his information would collapse. Taking his child and making clear what would happen if he did not comply was the mechanism chosen to create that pressure. For the first period of his captivity, Giuseppe was moved between locations across the provinces of Palermo, Trapani, and Agrigento. The Italian Anti-Mafia Directorate, which later investigated the full timeline of his captivity, confirmed he was held in conditions described officially as inhuman and degrading. He was kept in an underground shelter at one point in the Giambascio countryside near San Giuseppe Giotto. He was underfed. He was mistreated physically. His captors documented what they were doing to him and sent the photographs to his father. Santino Di Matteo received those photographs while in protective custody. He made desperate attempts to negotiate with his former associates for his son's release. He traveled to Sicily at one point to try to reach the people holding Giuseppe directly. None of it worked. His deposition was already legally binding. Even if he had wanted to fully retract everything, the legal mechanism did not allow for it in a way that would satisfy Brusca and the others. The months continued. Then more months. Giuseppe Di Matteo had been taken in November 1993. 1994 passed. 1995 passed. The boy who had been 12 when he was taken was now approaching 15. The Italian Anti-Mafia Directorate's official account of the case records that he had become physically ill from the sustained mistreatment. By the time 1996 began, he was described as too weakened to resist anything. On January 11th, 1996, 779 days after Giuseppe was taken from the riding stable, Giovanni Brusca gave the order. The exact words, as recorded in subsequent court testimony and confirmed across multiple Italian judicial proceedings, were, "Get rid of the puppy." Enzo Brusca, Giovanni's brother, along with crew members Vincenzo Chiodo and Salvatore Monticciolo, carried out the order. Giuseppe Di Matteo was strangled. He did not resist. He had nothing left with which to resist.
His body was then dissolved in a barrel of acid, a practice known within the organization as lupara bianca, meaning white shotgun, a term used for disappearances in which no body is ever recovered. The acid ensured that Giuseppe's remains could not be found, identified, or returned to his family for burial. The Italian state's investigation that followed resulted in the arrest of 27 people on charges including organized criminal association, abduction, and the act of taking a life. The convictions were confirmed on appeal in 2013. Giovanni Brusca received a life sentence, as did Matteo Messina Denaro, who was identified as one of the instigators of the abduction, and Leo Luca Bagarella. Several other participants received sentences ranging from 20 to 30 years. In July 2018, the Civil Court of Palermo ordered the Italian government to pay Giuseppe's mother and brother 2.2 million euros in compensation, drawn from the state fund for victims of organized crime. The payment was the court's formal acknowledgement of what had been done and who bore responsibility. Giovanni Brusca was released from prison in June 2021, having served 25 years. His release was legally required under Italian law governing the treatment of informants who cooperate fully with investigators. He had admitted to involvement in over 100 acts of lethal violence during his time with Cosa Nostra. The families of Falcone's escort officers, who had been killed at Kapaci, publicly expressed their anguish at the release. Falcone's sister Maria said the law should be respected because it was a law her brother had himself supported. She said this while also stating clearly that the news caused her distress. The Godfather contains one of the most quoted rules in the entire mythology of organized crime. You do not harm women and children. It is spoken as an absolute. It is presented as the moral floor beneath which the Corleone family will not go, even under the worst pressure. Cosa Nostra took a 12-year-old boy from a riding stable, held him underground for more than 2 years, sent photographs of his condition to his father as a negotiating tool, and dissolved his body in acid when the negotiation failed. The Italian government paid his family 2.2 million euros because the court needed a formal mechanism to acknowledge that what had happened was real. There is no version of the code that contains what happened to Giuseppe Di Matteo. There is only the distance between what the film says the organization believes and what the documented record shows it actually did. Everything in this video has moved in one direction, from the mythology the film constructed toward the reality the records confirm. The final case pulls both threads together because it involves a man who lived inside the real violence and then watched the film turn it into something else entirely, and who later said out loud that the film had captured something true about how the organization sounded and felt, even as the film hid everything that made the reality unbearable. Section 10. The Murder of Bugsy Siegel, June 20th, 1947. Benjamin Siegel was sitting on the chintz sofa in the living room of Virginia Hill's rented house at 810 North Linden Drive in Beverly Hills, California. It was the evening of June 20th, 1947. His associate, Alan Smiley, was sitting nearby. Siegel was reading the Los Angeles Times. The room was lit. The curtains were open. Outside, less than a few feet from the window, someone with a .30 caliber military carbine had positioned themselves in the darkness of the garden. At least 9 rounds came through the window in rapid succession. 3 of them struck Siegel in the head. 1 round hit with enough force to propel his right eye across the room, where it was found approximately 15 feet from his body. He was 41 years old. He died before anyone in the house could process what had just happened. Simultaneously, 3 of Meyer Lansky's associates walked into the Flamingo Hotel in Las Vegas and announced they were taking over operations. The coordination of those 2 events, the shooting in Beverly Hills and the takeover in Las Vegas happening at the same moment, tells you everything you need to know about how planned Siegel's removal actually was.
This was not a reactive decision. It had been scheduled. Benjamin Siegel had grown up in the Williamsburg neighborhood of Brooklyn, the son of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. As a teenager, he formed a street gang with Meyer Lansky, a friendship and criminal partnership that would last for decades.
By his early 20s, he was connected to the emerging national crime syndicate through Lansky's relationship with Lucky Luciano. Siegel was useful to the syndicate for a specific reason. He was genuinely willing to do the physical work that other, more business-oriented figures preferred to avoid. The FBI, which had been monitoring him for years, had implicated him in at least 30 acts of lethal violence by the time of his own removal. In 1936, Lansky suggested Siegel relocate to Los Angeles. The West Coast represented an expansion opportunity, gambling operations, narcotics distribution, and connections to the film industry that could be leveraged in various ways. Siegel moved, built relationships with Hollywood figures including Cary Grant and George Raft, and established the syndicate's presence across Southern California. He was effective at it. The Las Vegas idea came later. In 1945, Siegel became fixated on the development potential of a stretch of desert highway in Nevada where gambling was legal and the local government was willing to accommodate investment without excessive scrutiny. He persuaded the syndicate to back the construction of a luxury casino hotel, the Flamingo, with an initial budget of approximately $1 million. The construction went badly from the start. Costs escalated dramatically. The final bill came in somewhere between $5 and $6 million, depending on the source. The syndicate's leadership, particularly the figures who had fronted the money, believed Siegel was taking a portion of the construction funds for himself. His girlfriend, Virginia Hill, had been making trips to Switzerland, a fact that was noted and that suggested money was being moved into accounts that were not accessible to the people who had provided it. In December 1946, Lansky, Luciano, who was by then living in exile in Italy after his deportation, and other senior syndicate figures met in Havana, Cuba to discuss the situation. The decision reached at that meeting was conditional. If the Flamingo could demonstrate profitability, Siegel would be given the opportunity to settle the debt and make things right. If not, the decision was already made. The Flamingo opened on December 26, 1946, to a poor reception. Several weeks of losses followed. The hotel closed temporarily for additional construction. When it reopened in March 1947, the results improved significantly. By May 1947, the Flamingo had generated approximately $250,000 in profit. It was not enough. The exact reasoning, whether the profit was considered insufficient, whether the belief that Siegel had personally taken funds was simply too firm to be resolved by subsequent performance, or whether there were additional political factors within the syndicate's internal relationships, has never been fully established, because the people who made the final decision never discussed it in any recoverable form. What is established is that by June 1947, the decision was final and the timing had been set. The Beverly Hills Police Department investigated. The FBI investigated. Investigators concluded the weapon was a .30 caliber military carbine. A witness described hearing a car accelerating north towards Sunset Boulevard immediately after the shots. The identity of the shooter was never officially established. The case remains formally unsolved. Lansky denied any involvement for the rest of his life. Most serious organized crime historians do not find that denial credible, given the simultaneous takeover of the Flamingo. Whether the order came from Lansky personally, from Luciano in Italy, from the broader syndicate consensus, or from some combination of all three, is something the record does not conclusively answer. What the record does answer is the central question this case raises about the Godfather's version of organized crime. In the film, violence follows logic, betrayal produces consequences, disloyalty is punished. The rules are consistent and the outcomes follow from them.
Siegel's removal does not fit that framework. The Flamingo was profitable by the time he was taken out. The syndicate was already making money on the investment he had championed. If the sole issue had been the missing construction funds, the profitable operation provided a mechanism for recovering them that did not require disposing of the man running it. The decision was made anyway. The profit did not change it. This is what the film consistently avoids: the arbitrariness underneath the stated logic. The Corleones have reasons for everything they do. The reasons are presented as proportionate and considered. What the Siegel case documents is an organization that had made a political decision and then executed it regardless of whether the stated justifications still applied. The Flamingo was making money. Bugsy Siegel was reading the newspaper. Neither of those facts mattered once the men with the real authority had decided they did not.
10 cases across 6 decades of documented history, from a Manhattan office building in 1931 to a Beverly Hills living room in 1947 to a Sicilian motorway in 1992, all pointing toward the same gap. The distance between what the Godfather presents organized crime to be and what the verified record shows it actually was. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.